Hey, Larken Rose here, and I'm making another video that's an excerpt from one of the talks I did at PorkFest this week, or last week. I can't keep track of what day it is. It's an excerpt from one of the talks that didn't get recorded because it wasn't at the pavilion. Now, this should be a nice short thing. We'll see. I tend to babble on and on. But it takes a little bit of focus to understand. It's actually a pretty dang simple concept, but it's a little bit meta. So, there you are with your moral code, your sense of right and wrong. Now, that may be based on a zillion different things, like the values your parents raised you with, or the people around you, their beliefs, or a church, or a religion, or a book, or whatever, or some philosophical theory of universally preferential behavior, or whatever. If you believe in right and wrong, that's all that matters for this. Now, if you don't believe in right and wrong at all, if you're a moral nihilist and think everything is just a preference, then there's a shortcut to pointing out that government is insane, because authority is the right to rule. Well, you can't believe anything as the right to rule if you don't believe there's such thing as right at all. If you don't believe morality is a thing, you can't believe in authority, because authority is a moral concept. It's not just the gang that has the ability to control other people. It's the gang that has the right to control other people, and therefore those people have an obligation to obey. That's how that concept works. So, assuming you believe in right and wrong somehow based on something, and I don't care what for this conversation, you kind of literally have to be schizophrenic, split personality, insane to believe in authority, which is unfortunate because the vast majority of people in the world believe in authority. But here's why. So there you are in your head with your judgment of right and wrong, your conscience, your morality, however you want to describe that. And along comes an authority like a government and says, we dictate the following law. Now, that law might match your moral code. They might say, don't murder people. Now, if you already thought murder was bad and you already weren't going to, their law is kind of redundant and irrelevant and unnecessary in your case, because you didn't need politicians to tell you that that's bad, and murder didn't become bad because they legislated it. You would have understood that it's bad even if they repealed that law. So, okay, when the dictates of authority match your moral code, then it's just redundant and unnecessary. But what happens when the dictates of authority conflict with your moral code, with what you believe is right and wrong, regardless of what you base that on? So they issue a decree. We have passed this through the legislative process. This is now law. In order to be a law-abiding citizen, you must do this, and you are a criminal by their definitions if you don't. However, your moral code says, yeah, but I think that law is bad and wrong. If there's a disagreement, then in order to feel obligated to obey them, here are the gymnastics your brain has to do. I, inside my head, using my moral judgment, my conscience, my whatever you want to call it, I have decided that I am morally obligated to obey those people because I have decided that I believe them to be authority. Now, authority is always in the eye of the beholder, because if somebody else goes, I'm not obligated to obey them, then from their vantage point, they have no authority. That's what that means. The person issuing commands, them saying, we have the right to rule you, that doesn't make them authority unless somebody believes them. And then they're authority in the eyes of the people who believe them. So you sitting there with your moral judgment and conscience, whatever that's based on, if you decide you're obligated to obey them, in other words, you decide that they're authority, then you have to also decide, I, using my moral judgment, have decided that I shouldn't rely on my moral judgment, and that I should instead obey them, obey their official legal dictates, whatever. So that literally requires you to use your moral judgment to decide that you shouldn't use your moral judgment. That's how insane you have to be to believe in any external authority. Because you have to decide, because it's your perception that decides whether they're an authority in your eyes. You would have to decide that the morally right thing for you to do is to ignore your own judgment of right and wrong in favor of obeying them. And that boils down to, I have decided that the morally right thing for me to do is to do the thing that I have decided is morally wrong. I'm going to say that again, because it sounds bonkers, because it is bonkers. I have morally decided that they're an authority I'm obligated to obey, and that the morally right thing for me to do is obey them, even if what they're telling me to do goes against what that same moral judgment inside my head said is wrong. In other words, the right thing for me to do is the wrong thing. And the wrong thing for me to do is the right thing. You have to think that. If you can call that thinking. You have to think that to believe in an external authority. You have to imagine that they outrank you, that their decrees trump your moral judgment, in spite of the fact that it's your moral judgment that you used to decide that they have the right to control you and you have an obligation to obey. So you're using your moral judgment to decide that you shouldn't use your moral judgment. It's that insane for any authority. And it can be government, it can be a king, it can be religious, it can be anybody who claims the right to boss you around. For you to agree that, yes, you should boss me around and I have an obligation to obey you even if it disagrees with what I think. That's insane. I'm going to add one more thing to this that makes it insane and non-existent. That nobody really believes in authority. They kind of sort of temporarily do. That because there's the obvious conflict in their brain, they're forever doing this weird juggling act trying to pretend those two things can coexist inside one brain when they stinking can't. Logically, they can't. It's impossible. But one of the easiest ways to demonstrate that is if I ask people, well, can you think of a law? It doesn't even have to be here now. It can be some other time, some other place, whatever, where the law was illegitimate and the right thing to do was for people to disobey it. And, really easy example is slavery used to be legal. And the people helping slaves escape, they were lawbreakers. And almost everybody now recognizes, the lawbreakers were the good guys and the law enforcers were the bad guys. And there's a million other examples you can think of, but that's a handy one that pretty much everyone these days says, that law was bogus. People didn't have any moral obligation to obey it. Now, I have to point out there's also the practical level of it can be dangerous to disobey, but this discussion is about the moral obligation. Like, you may think this law is stupid and bogus, or this tax funds something I'm against, but I'm too scared to disobey because they'll beat me up and steal my stuff or cage me or something. Like, that's a different consideration. That's practical considerations. So you may not choose to resist some beast that has more guns than you or whatever. But I'm just talking about moral obligation because that's the concept of authority. Authority doesn't mean the people who have the ability to boss me around. It means the people who have the right, the moral right to boss me around, and the people who I have a moral obligation to obey. But here's the problem. Well, I already explained the problem, but here's the thing that points out how ridiculous the problem is, and points out that everyone deep down inside is already a voluntarist, and at the end of the day doesn't really believe in authority. Even though they kind of do, part-time, in half of their schizophrenic brain. Because if they can think of an example, like slavery or anything else, where they think, well, that in that case the law is wrong and people should disobey, what they're saying is, at the end of the day, they still reserve the right to use their own moral judgment to decide, okay, if you order me to do this thing, then that's wrong, and I don't have to obey. Well, if you get to decide when you're obligated to obey them, then by definition, they're not authority anymore. Authority means the thing you're obligated to obey. So if you tell Congress or a king, you are my rightful king, I must obey you, unless and until I decide I'm not obligated to obey you, unless I decide one of your laws or all of your laws are stupid and bogus and illegitimate and I have the right to disobey, and would be morally justified in disobeying, that's putting yourself above authority. Well, guess what? There's no such thing as putting your moral conscience above authority, because the moment you do, by definition, it's not authority anymore. It's just some people bossing you around. The moment you decided you weren't obligated to obey them in any situation, they cease to be authority in your own head. Authority is in the eye of the beholder. And the moment you say, well, that law I'm going to disobey, that's you saying, okay, this thing happened and now I'm not obligated to obey you. You don't have the right to force this on me. You are not my rightful Lord and Master, whether it's a legislature, a king, or whatever. Everybody can think of an example that they would do that in. But that boils down to not only the insanity I mentioned before, but it boils down to saying, yes, I'm obligated to obey you unless the time comes that I decide I'm not. Well, if the choice is yours, even if you never make that choice, even if you keep obeying and feeling obligated to obey, if at the end of the day you can still go, okay, that's a bridge too far, you went over the line, now I'm not obeying, and I don't have an obligation to obey, that means that whole time you outranked them, because you could have decided at any time, this law is bogus, I'm no longer obligated to obey. So everybody who believes in government, not only do they have that contradiction in their heads of any notion of authority requires thinking I'm morally obligated to obey that thing over my own moral judgment, which is the thing that decided I was morally obligated to obey them in the first place. But on top of that, everybody also says I'm morally obligated to obey them unless I decide I'm not, in some case. Whether you decide that all the time or whether you decide that only if they legalize slavery or murder or something. Doesn't matter where you draw the line. If you're the one who gets to draw the line and decide when you're morally obligated to obey, that means you outrank them. That means they're not authority. And this is just a conceptual way to prove, one of several ways, that authority cannot exist. If there was actually such a thing as authority, it would mean they have the right to rule, that's what the term means, and you would be morally obligated to obey. No matter what. Not, you are my rightful king unless I decide you're not. That doesn't mean anything. That's true of everybody. I could pick some random person on the street and say, you have the right to rule me, except when I decide you don't have the right to rule me, which, as it happens, is all the time, so have a nice day. That's how you have to view everything to literally be sane. And once you recognize that, then you're forced to recognize that authority isn't a thing. It never was a thing. And that I became an anarchist not by bickering over what might work better, but by figuring out there's no such thing as legitimate government. There can't be. I don't mean there hasn't been one yet. I mean, conceptually, there isn't such thing as authority. It's a logically impossible concept. And therefore, government, which is the exercise of authority over a people or place, cannot exist. It's based on an impossible premise. And so a lot of people think the debate is about, well, what would work better? And to me, as I've said before, that's like arguing about, well, would Christmas work better with Santa Claus or without Santa Claus? And I'm the one coming along and saying, that's not a debate worth having. Santa Claus isn't real. Like, whether you think we need him, whether you think it would work better, he's not real. And it would behoove humanity to recognize reality and then plan accordingly, instead of basing a huge amount of human behavior on hallucinating something whose very existence is conceptually impossible, which is authority, which is the foundation of all government. So anyway, if you want more about this, you can read my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which slices and dices it and gives a couple more proofs of why authority, it isn't just a bad idea, it doesn't just end up with bad results, it's an impossible concept. Not just, it's not going to be used right or something. It doesn't exist. It's Santa Claus. It's not real. And unfortunately, people imagining it to exist, A, makes them into insane schizos, and B, makes lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of basically decent people cheer for violent aggression against everybody they know and billions of people they don't know, because they've been taught that, well, if authority and government does these things, then it's okay, because they're exempt from the normal laws of morality. So if you want to bicker over what works, fine. But just like Santa Claus, authority isn't real. It never has been. It can't possibly be. You can have agreement, you can have organization and cooperation, you can do a whole bunch of things by consent. But the notion that you, inside your own head, could be sane while believing you're obligated to ignore your own judgment in favor of obedience to somebody else, that's just bonkers. And when you recognize that and accept that, and literally just accept what is, accept reality, never mind predictions or history or all the other philosophy, when you just accept reality, you have to be an anarchist. Because an anarchist means rule by no one, and accepting reality is to accept nobody has the right to rule. There isn't authority. And then reality, like for me, reality decided I was an anarchist when I got to understand it. It wasn't a choice. I can't choose to be a statist any more than I can choose to believe in Santa Claus again. And once you see the proofs of how insane authority is, you're not going to have a choice. And sorry about that, because I know lots of people who it made sort of uncomfortable, including me, to finally accept, wow, the premise of all of the political thought, not only of the babbling politicians and the mainstream media, but all the people in the world who believe in government, the premise of every single one of their beliefs is literally insane and logically impossible.